Hello, my fellow geeks. You are listening to the Indian AvGeek, and I am Vishal Mehra. November 2024 is done, and it has been the best month ever for domestic aviation in India. As of 29th of November, there were 1 crore 40 lakhs 23,778 passengers across 91,728 flights. Let's see if December beats this, but there's no doubt November has been history making. Back to now, and today we have probably one of the most analytical and respected minds in Indian aviation. He is not directly in Indian aviation now, but is most definitely connected to it in many ways. Vasuki Prasad dedicates his time and efforts into analysis, discussions, and solutions that allow airlines sustainable profitability. Based at Singapore, he is presently the marketing director for Asia Pacific at Embraer Commercial Aviation. Earlier, Vasuki was with Vistara as the head of commercial planning and analysis. After graduating with an engineering degree in electronics and communication, he started his career with Honeywell Aerospace and holds 2 US patents. Brilliant to have you on the show this week, Vasuki.
Hello, Vishal. Thank you for having me.
Tell us about your background, Vasuki, and how you got into aviation.
I've always been interested in aircraft, and that was something that started off in school. And thereafter, my internships during engineering were also very focused on aviation. So I did one with the airport, one at Jet Airways maintenance, one with the aircraft, an approved training organization, which is a flight simulator center at an airline in Indonesia. So my passion has always taken me to such internships. And the reason I did engineering was because I wanted to be a pilot. But back then, it was also the period when Kingfisher was not really as promising as one would have thought it to be. And this is well before it really had much of its trouble. So the whole idea was to have something that was, rock solid and stable in terms of backing. And then later you go into flying. Eventually, when I did finish off my engineering, the whole situation in terms of the stability to become a pilot had kind of deteriorated. So since then, I progressed, got into Honeywell. Electronics was my passion because I always loved the aircraft cockpit and the flight deck, all the displays and so forth. Got 2 US patents, again, both in aviation. One had to do with the Boeing cockpit light. And after getting those 2 US patents, building flight simulators for some of my colleagues in Honeywell. And after that, started my own business, which was in flight simulators. Ran that for 3 years. Good product. Was terrible as a business because I didn't understand business. And that's when I took to blogging because I wanted to understand how an airline is run because the aviation industry was the only industry I could understand. And by studying airline profit and loss balance sheets, I could relate to a subject rather than looking at financial statements of a industry that I did not understand. So first started off blogging on technical aspects of aircraft, and then went on to the whole financial side of stuff. Was grateful enough to have been noticed by certain CXOs in the Indian side. One of them being Sanjeev Kapoor. So he would tell me what's good in my analysis and what was bad in the analysis, and guide me and so forth. It was after that when he quit SpiceJet and he joined Vistara, was when he needed analytical ability in Vistara. I might be going a little too ahead in terms of talking about the journey, but nevertheless, it's part of the story. So he wanted analytical ability in Vistara, and so he created a department of commercial planning and analysis, put me in as the head of the department, and that was absolute fun. And after spending some time in Vistara, then went on to an aircraft manufacturer, which is Embraer, and it's been 7 years in Embraer as of today.
Terrific. So let's take a step back. At Vistara, just help me understand what all were you taking care of?
So commercial planning and analysis was, to put it uh, very accurately, was me being a consultant within the commercial division of Vistara. So you had the flight operations division, you had the finance division, one of them was commercial. And within commercial, I was like a consultant, an analytically oriented consultant. So go to various departments within the division, be it, for example, sales, be it revenue management, perhaps even network planning, operations control center, the crew department, the airports, and all of that was under commercial back then in Vistara. Later things got moved around a bit. And the idea and the whole job was identify problems, because certain areas did have issues where they were not optimal. So go in, identify the problems, identify the solutions, and implement the solutions. It also, of course, meant coming up with the solutions. So that's essentially what it is, to be very truthful. It's got a great long title, but it's a very analytically driven consultant role within commercial, which was to solve problems.
So those problems could have been logistics related, could have been finance related, could have been marketing related, or whatever else. And in short, your responsibility was to think of those solutions and and try and solve it through the insights that you had, through the analysis that you were able to undertake, basis the data that you were given, something like that.
That's right. So in commercial planning and analysis, we had pretty much unfettered access to a lot of data. And the idea was to go through that data and to identify trends. So one of the first things we had to do was to ensure that there was clean data, because we had a lot of data and not all of it was usable. There was some dirt and junk which had to be cleaned. And then you take the data and then you start making sense of the data, not really backward looking so much, but more into forward looking. For example, with revenue management, we built this beautiful tool, this fabulous tool that could tell many days, even many weeks out, which flight would potentially have a low revenue. And then revenue management would go and pounce on that particular flight, and that's right, play around with the fare and whatnot to kind of salvage that flight. So that was great. That was one of the more analytical things that was done in my role out there, which was heavily on revenue management. Revenue management and us worked so well together. And if my memory recalls correctly, it was in that period, it was, of course, a trio of Sanjeev Kapoor as the CCO, the head of revenue management, Santosh, and then all of us colleagues, and the tool that I built together, which ensured that we had the highest revenue per flight in Vistara in its history, while it was still a domestic airline. We're talking about pre late 2019. So the efforts really paid off that way.
Brilliant. And were the city pairs, for example, for those high revenue flights, were those majorly metros, or even you had metros and non-metros, which turned out to be really successful? Just curious, if you think you can answer that.
I don't think I can recollect exactly, because we were looking at everything on a flight number basis. We'd gone into very, very granular data. But generally speaking, your revenues are always the best metro to metro at the peak times. Not necessarily off peak, because you could be doing, for example, a Bombay Delhi red eye flight, and it wouldn't really give you very high revenue. So it's a combination of the market and it's a combination of the timing. And then you'd have these odd sectors like Delhi, Chandigarh, which would be a fabulous sector. And you realize that most of the passengers are actually connecting through Delhi on Vistara's expansive network. So there were many factors that went into it. Sometimes it would be going even into a non-metro city and doing really well, because Vistara's network allowed onward connections that were quite valuable to passengers. But generally, any route that touches the capitals do very well.
Let's stay on this for a second more on Vistara. I was speaking to one of your ex-colleagues a couple of weeks back, Solomon Wheeler, and he brought up that how you were instrumental in thinking about and bringing the retrojet campaign to life. Do you remember anything of that? Anything that you can share with us? Your memories of that?
Look, Solo is an awesome guy, and sometimes he's far kinder with his words than reality is. And although he has a lot more white hair than I do, his memory tends to be far better than mine. So I can't really seem to correlate too much with the
He,
high
he
words of.
did specially mention you, by the way. He mentioned Sanjeev, of course, and he said Vasuki as well. But all right. Hmm.
That's him being extremely kind. I did work on the retrojet project, but the greater contribution came in from the marketing team, which was led by Solomon Wheeler. I was the guy who was helping with the details, making sure that it was as close to the Tata Airlines livery of then. You're talking about the 19 probably 40s on the Dakota DC-3s, the
Right, right.
Douglas DC.
Yeah.
So where I believe added value was in getting the details right, but in terms of the idea conceptualization and all that, it's Solo, Sanjeev, and rest all. I don't deserve as much credit as he's given.
All right. Let's get on to Embraer. Now, we all know Embraer is world's third largest plane maker. That's it's a big deal. How did this current role for you came about?
The current role, I've worn many hats in Embraer, so I'll have to give you a bit of a journey. But essentially, how I got into Embraer was based on a certain desire to be involved in broader things while at Vistara. Vistara was fabulous, where you got to experience everything about the whole commercial department, and also you worked with other divisions like finance and whatnot to try and solve puzzles. So you have one piece, finance is one piece, you piece them together and you solve a puzzle. But where I wanted to really broaden was into the aircraft as an asset side. So all this was on the operational side, all this was on the revenue side, but my core strength and my core specialization, I believe, was really in aircraft performance, aircraft economics, airline economics, and marrying all of that together was something where I saw a role in an OEM to be the next step. Vistara was great, but then there is only so much an airline can offer, and there's always something that some other industry can offer a lot more. And that's where I found that in Embraer there was that opportunity. So moved into Embraer in marketing, more like a analyst, and then became an airline marketing manager, and eventually I got into sales. So I did sales for 3 years, where I placed 4 aircraft in India, sold one aircraft as well, and then signed a couple of LOIs. And from then, now I've moved into a senior role in marketing at Embraer. So I've been wearing quite a few hats around here, and that is the excitement of being in Embraer.
Let's talk about India for a second. After all, the podcast is called the Indian AvGeek. How is
Mhm.
Embraer doing in Asia Pacific, according to you, Vasuki, and more importantly, in India?
I believe Embraer is on an upward trend when it comes to establishing its presence in Asia Pacific. Um, Embraer has been phenomenally successful in the North American market. So you have a tremendous three-digit number of Embraer aircraft flying across the continental US. You just put a filter on Flight Radar 24 for the Embraer E-jets, and you'll see how much is really flying in out there. And then you have a good number of Embraer jets also flying in Europe. And when it comes to Asia, you have very good presence in Japan. You have phenomenal presence in Australia. And in the rest of Asia, this is picking up. So right here in Singapore, there is Scoot, which flies Embraer E190 E2s, which is our next generation aircraft. And we had Virgin Australia, which recently announced and signed for Embraer E2 aircraft as well.
Right.
And there have been a couple of other announcements in the region. Then we had the E-jets coming back into India through Star Air. And now Star Air is the largest private regional airline ever in the history of Indian aviation. And that shows you that it's a combination of course, what the airline has been doing well. It's also some credit to the government schemes that help sustain regional aviation today, as well as the tool, which is the aircraft and how it fits into the Indian market today. So it's been an uptrend, good activity, good interest with more to come, hopefully, in the very near future.
Star Air indeed was all over the news a couple of weeks back with its announcements, and congratulations to you, your team, definitely on the rise. And I've also seen, I think you've made some recently some appointments in the Indian market also to focus on that aspect more. So, all the best wishes to you.
Thank
Are you also facing, is Embraer also facing supply chain challenges like other manufacturers are?
you. The answer is yes, but to a lesser degree.
Vasuki, when an aircraft manufacturer like yourself, let's say Embraer, meets various airlines, how does a sales pitch usually happens? I'm very interested to know that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Firstly, there are very few people you actually can pitch to because there are few airlines. And this is more of a B2B space. It's not really a B2C space. And the sales pitch actually comes very late in the process. So, just to give you an idea, the typical sales cycle lasts for roughly half a decade. If you're an airline, I could start speaking to you today. And if I'm lucky, I close something with you probably 5 years later. It,
Wow.
of course, varies airline to airline, geography to geography. Market conditions play a role, but typically you can expect a long sales cycle to kick in. But even before the sales pitch is done, what we do is and I think every OEM does that, is you meet airlines and then you have a conversation with them to try and understand uh, what their pain points are today, and try and understand if, for example, even your aircraft, whether it is a fit or if it's a solution that can really make a difference to the customer. And sometimes you intentionally don't want to offer your aircraft. And when I say aircraft, I'm talking about aircraft as a solution to your problem to a customer, because it may not really be the solution for the problem that they're having. And at the same time, we may also not want certain customers to take our aircraft just in the best interests of everyone. So the first and most important aspect is to really identify what the problems are and how much your solution can really make an impact to the customer. And then eventually you start working with them together, trying to see if potentially your solution, which is your aircraft, can solve the problem for them. And if it does, then the interest comes in, and then comes the whole processes about proposals and whatnot. But that comes very late in, very, very, very late in. The time it takes to really sit with the customer, work with them, understand them, probably do a study with them, and then look at how it can really make an impact to them. That is where a lot of effort goes in, and that's where marketing plays a very vital role.
I somehow always had this notion that the price negotiation will take a lion's share of time in that process that you said, let's say of half a decade or 3 years, 4 years, whatever. But what you're saying is maybe the price negotiation does not take so much time and other factors are much more important. Is that right?
It is partly right. So the engagement with the customer, if you look at the typical cycle, right, from the time you initially begin serious contact with them to the time you actually close, if you're lucky, while that may be 5 years, finally you're going to spend a lion's share of your time trying to understand them, trying to educate them, and see if the aircraft can really make sense to them. And only when they're really convinced that, what, I think we can go somewhere with this aircraft, is when you then start issuing proposals. So then it goes into a very different phase. In that second phase, the phase where you're trying to then look at contracts, right? You come up with the proposal and then you're trying to negotiate on the price. Yes, in that the price, well, actually, it's the negotiation of terms, not just price, because price alone isn't the only driver, but the negotiation of terms does take
Commercial
a
terms.
line
Yeah.
uh, of the second phase. But overall, if you look at the total engagement you have with the particular prospect, it's the marketing part, the education, and the working together that takes the lion's share.
And you would still have airlines who wouldn't know about Embraer or Embraer jets, even though you guys are so well entrenched in so many markets and are very well known. There are still cases when you need to evangelize customers or prospective airlines.
Not in terms of the brand, in terms of
The
Embraer and
capability of the aircraft.
that's right. And that happens with every product. Like you'll have airlines that know about the A, the B, and in case of us, the E, which is E for Embraer, right? You'll have them aware generally of the products, but they really wouldn't know the specifics and the nuances of the product to that much detail. And that is where we come in to try and educate them on what the product can really do. So you'll have a lot of moments of aha where they're like, oh, we didn't know the aircraft could do this. That happens. It's not that they don't know about the aircraft, but it's more about we didn't know the aircraft could do this. That's
Right.
that's
And
that's
is
what
it
we
the
see.
network planning team that you engage with the most, or the finance team, or other teams as well?
I think it's everyone. It's
Everyone.
everyone that's involved in the. So essentially, you can break an airline into two parts. One part of the airline that looks into the future, and one part of the airline that's working on today. And what's working on today is typically operations. And what's looking into the future would be your strategy teams like network planning, corporate planning, and those kinds. And different airlines have different structures, and you'll be surprised as to how diverse and non-consistent it is across airlines as to who gets involved. Some airlines have specialized aircraft acquisition verticals. Most airlines don't have that. So it depends. So when you interact with them, you just interact with probably a couple of uh, touch points, who then later open up the doors to others who are involved in the strategy or the forward-looking part of it. But it varies considerably from airline to airline, and what you work with one airline may not be how you work with another airline.
One of your most recognizable campaigns at Embraer, and I think you've made a great name for it, is Profit Hunter, emblazoned on your E2s. It paid a visit to the Indian market as well, I remember. How did that came about, Vasuki? And
Multiple times.
sorry?
The multiple times it's paid a visit to
Yes.
the Indian market
Yeah.
multiple times.
And how's that campaign doing? How did that come about?
So there are always two aspects to a campaign when you look at it from a B2B business perspective, right? There's one that gets you for example, the social media eyeballs, and that's been fabulously successful. And there's also one where it kind of brings how do I put it? It brings interest in the product simply because this is something a little quirky. It's something offbeat. You don't find aircraft manufacturers getting this creative. And I think this is the Brazilian part of Embraer that has really brought it out. And kudos to Embraer for having done this as well. Uh, Overall, the reception of this Profit Hunter campaign has been fabulous, both from the B2, I wouldn't say C, but B to the end customer, which is, we don't sell to passengers, but we sell to airlines. But then the final people who really fly on it are the customers. So on that indirect B2C part of it, it's been successful. On the B2B part of it as well, it's brought in a lot of interest. So overall, I see this as a very successful campaign.
So the E2s are called profit hunters, right? The E-jets are called business warriors. ERJs I saw on your website described as runway legends. Again, how did these nomenclatures came about? Are these something that you have also worked on, or they predate you? It's all very interesting, and like you said, it's certainly the Latino side of Embraer, much more creative than the A's and the B's. Can you throw some light on that?
In terms of the nomenclature, the profit hunter is more to bring to light what this aircraft can really do for an airline. And why that's important is if you look at an aircraft like the E195E2, you have a cost per seat that is very similar to a narrow body jetliner like the 320 or the 737 on a per seat basis. But then when you look at it on a total operating cost basis, it is way, way, way lower. So your total expense to operate is lower, but your competitiveness in terms of your cost per seat is just as good as the 320 or the 737. And when you do that, there are so many markets, Vishal, where you have low cost carriers, or even for that matter, most airlines that try to stick to a single narrow body fleet and they deploy that all across the country or all across the region. And when I say region, when you fly international as well. And not all routes are dense enough to be able to fill the aircraft repeatedly or even sustainably on a year-round basis. Yes, you will have peak seasons when you can fill the aircraft, but you also have lean seasons when you cannot. So on an annual basis, and that's how we look at it, because even your financial statements, for example, your annual reports come out on an annual basis. You may not be able to make certain routes profitable because you don't have sufficient demand. And that's where this aircraft comes in to say that on many routes where you lose money, this can step in to be your profit hunter. It can hunt profit. It can also open up routes simply because it's a smaller aircraft. It's less expensive to operate, and because it can sniff and smell profit or open up new routes with less risk. That's how the name Profit Hunter came about. When you look at the previous generation of the E-jet, so the current generation, which was a couple of years ago, was the next generation, but the next generation today, as we stand, is the current generation. The previous generation of the E-jets is well, just the E-jets. They're not the E-jets E2. They're the E-jets, and the E-jets are aptly called business warriors because if you see how they're being used in Europe and how they're being used in uh, even parts of Australia and how they're even being used, especially in Northern America, is where these aircraft operate high frequency flights that take passengers from airline hubs to smaller cities or elsewhere and then bring them back in. So, they're like
The
the
feed,
front
they are providing that feed, which is very important
providing
to hubs.
providing the feed. Absolutely. And they serve as the front line in getting passengers to fill your wide bodies that can fly international. So, your front line, you're fighting it out to get the feed. That's where I believe the word business warrior comes from. When you look at ERJ, which is out of production, and it's like probably not the previous generation, but the previous generation, honestly, I have no idea why that name was given. It's even before my time in Embraer.
From a marketing perspective, Vasuki, how do you integrate your offline and online marketing strategies?
By online, I'm assuming you refer to, for example, social media or anything that's
That's right.
broadcast, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So there is integration, but where I see a difference is the online presence or the online marketing activity is more broadcast. I see that more as bringing awareness to the brand or renewing awareness to the brand. And sometimes it may also be sending out a message to the market because Embraer is publicly listed, right? And then you have investors, both individual investors, institutional investors. So you just want to bring out updates on the company and talk about what's there. Sometimes even just catch the attention of anyone from the airline who's scrolling through social media. I see that though as something that is necessary, but not core to what, for example, I look into. And as an OEM, it's predominantly B2B. And most of the work is pretty much offline rather than online. That is, in person meetings, in person events, and so forth.
So
It
air
does
shows
help.
are a very important part of the entire mix.
Air shows are important. Air shows are important. And this is just my personal opinion. This is absolutely my personal opinion. I see air shows and their relevance really diminishing today in the era of immense digital connectivity. Um, at air shows, and this is just my reasoning, in the past, air shows made sense because you had anyone who was looking to buy an aircraft coming to the air show, or airlines coming to the air show, and people who had to sell aircraft going to the air show, right? So it was just a meeting point, period. And back then, we didn't even have as many events as we have today. But today, in such a connected world, I could probably get in touch with someone first over, let's say, a Zoom call, and then later go and meet him in the office. And simply because we're so much more connected today, I can today somehow figure out who is the man who wants to start an airline, or woman, as the case may be, or who is it who's running an airline, and go and meet the person. And the funny thing is, at air shows, I see us repeatedly meeting the people we already have relationships with. In other sense, today, in today's world, I see air shows uh, are not as value adding as they used to be years ago. But this is just my personal opinion. And I think the digitally connected world that we live in today is a large cause for that. Everything is accessible, information is accessible. You don't need to come to an air show to learn about a product. You could even see a virtual reality video of the aircraft and the cabin online. And then you can make some of your, part of your decisions right
Initial
there.
research, yeah. Yeah. Right. I couldn't agree with you more. I can think of an example in a related industry, in somehow related industry. I remember about what, 12, 13 odd years back, Apple used to be a regular at these Mac World expos and events, right? At every Mac World, the keynote used to be Steve Jobs going up on the stage and launching an Apple product. So they had to innovate and they had to plan their products around the dates of Macworld, right?
Right.
So eventually, what Steve Jobs decided was, guys, we had all the help we needed from Macworld, but now I think we are big enough and we'll have our own events. So they branched off, and eventually, unfortunately, Macworld also kind of died its own. It kind of faded away. So I can understand when you say that.
That's a very good example you take. And what I've noticed is while deals are still announced at air shows, I see lesser and lesser deals being announced at air shows. In the sense, previously announcements would be held off for air shows, and now I don't see that as such a big deal. Airlines, including the largest in India, for instance, have not always announced at air shows. So that kind of relationship is no longer.
I think, in fact, now the Corpcom teams probably at all major airlines feel that they're, as much exposure as they can get, potentially doing a standalone event or a announcement would be more than bunching it up with other airlines at an air show.
Because you're not competing for attention.
Yeah, and in I think in cases of Airbus and Boeing both, especially with some airlines in the country, the heads of state have gotten involved, and you cannot have the heads of state involved, at a third country's air show so much. So there are geopolitics, there are commercial considerations, so many things involved. So it makes perfect sense. How is Embraer positioning itself, Vasuki, against competitors in the industry?
Well, I can't speak for the competitors, but essentially we focus on our strengths. And here's a very funny thing, Vishal. No two aircraft are actually head-on. And in my personal observation and my studies, I think the aircraft that have really come closest to being near head-ons were the A320 of the previous generation and the 737 of the previous generation. Like even when you look at it probably from a Max versus a Neo perspective, I think there's more gap than there was between the previous 320 and the NG. So besides that, it's very hard to find two aircraft that 100% compete. And I think this probably happens intentionally because aircraft manufacturers and they need to differentiate from the competition when they're trying to design an aircraft, build features and design points that are different from the competition to solve a different problem, so that you don't have two products that are trying to solve the exact same problem. You have two products that are trying to solve two different problems, and you pick which product better solves your problem. It's always better
Yeah.
because whenever an airline makes a decision on an aircraft, they have never chosen the perfect aircraft. They never have, because the concept of a perfect aircraft does not exist. They always choose aircraft that best suits their problem. And the best doesn't mean that it 100% solves a problem, but best among every other aircraft suits a problem. And the reason I said this was because we just focus on our strengths. And that is why the whole meeting with the customers, spending time with them, understanding what their problem is, and seeing whether our aircraft as a solution can be a fit for them is very important. So rather than working off on how we can differentiate ourselves from the competitor, we see how we can best solve the customer's problem. So the C focus, rather than from the competitor, goes into the customer.
All right, let's put a pause to this for now. Our chat was supposed to be 30 minutes or so, but it went beyond an hour. So I've decided to divide this into two episodes. Been eye opening chatting with this man, and if I was you, I would look forward to the next installment of this chat as well. As I say Dusvidania for the week and sip my vodka, it's good to remind you all that we are streaming on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and all other major podcast apps. Take our few seconds, rate us, leave us a feedback, and with that, I wish you well and happy flying, my friends.